It's just a circle of stones on a windy plain. But it's more than that, isn't it? Giant rocks, some weighing more than a school bus, carted over hundreds of miles. Shaped and lifted by people with no metal tools, no wheels, no written language. They started building it before the pyramids of Giza were finished. They kept working on it for 1,500 years. That's longer than the time between now and the Norman conquest of England. How and why? We have some ideas. We have theories. We have a lot of smart people digging in the dirt and running computer models. But for every answer we find, 10 new questions pop up. The more we learn, the less we seem to know for sure. What was the master plan? How did a Stone Age society organize a project that would outlive generations? How did they lift a 30-ton block of stone on top of two others? It's a monument to human ingenuity or human madness. Or maybe both. Let's walk through the questions that keep archaeologists up at night. The ones that linger in the midst of Salisbury Plain. Number 20. Why here? And of all places, why Salisbury Plain? You could build a monument anywhere, so why this spot? It's a windswept, fairly unremarkable piece of chalk downland. There are no major rivers right next to it. No special mountains. No obvious strategic value. Yet, for some reason, this place became the most important center in Neolithic Britain for over 1,000 years. Something drew people here. The first thing to know is that Stonehenge wasn't built in an empty landscape. It's far from it. When the first builders arrived around 3000 BC, the area was already ancient. Just a mile or two away lies the Stonehenge Cursus. It's a massive earthwork, a long, thin rectangle stretching for nearly 2 miles. It was built centuries before the first stones at Stonehenge were raised. Nobody knows its purpose. You know, it's not a road, it's not a fortification, it just sits there, a huge scar on the landscape pointing roughly towards sunrise on the spring equinox. People were already doing big, strange things here. Then there's the geology. A team led by Mike Parker Pearson from University College London has pushed a compelling theory. His Stonehenge Riverside project, which ran from 2003 to 2009, excavated sites all around the monument. He argues that the landscape itself was symbolic. The area is marked by a series of natural chalk ridges and valleys. Unusually, these features align perfectly with the midwinter and midsummer solstices. If you stand on the ridge at Durrington Walls, another massive henge complex a couple of miles away, and look towards Stonehenge at midwinter, the sun sets right behind the monument. It seems the landscape itself was a ready-made celestial calendar. The people who built Stonehenge didn't impose their ideas on the land, they saw their ideas reflected in it. The place was already special. Parker Pearson's team also found evidence of a great avenue connecting Stonehenge to the River Avon. He believes this formed a ritual pathway. People would travel down the river to the avenue at Durrington Walls, the land of the living, marked by wooden circles and evidence of massive feasts. Then they would proceed along another avenue to Stonehenge, the land of the dead, a domain of stone and ancestors. The two sites were two halves of a whole religious complex. Salisbury Plain wasn't just a random spot. It was a preordained, sacred map. But that theory, as neat as it is, relies on interpretation. The natural solstice alignments are there, but are they the reason people came? Or is it a coincidence we now find meaningful? The Cursus is older than Stonehenge. What was its purpose, and why did the Stonehenge builders decide to put their monument next to it? It's like finding a modern cathedral built next to an abandoned, unexplainable alien structure. The connection must be there, but we don't know what it is. What if the reason is simpler and lost to us? Maybe it was the site of a founding myth, a place where a great leader died or a celestial event was witnessed. Maybe it had a unique ecosystem rich in a particular plant or animal that was vital to their culture. We're looking at the hardware, the stones, and ditches, but the software, the belief system that drove it all, is gone. We're trying to guess the rules of a game when all we have is the board. What if the natural solstice alignments are a complete coincidence, and we're just seeing patterns where none were intended? Could the real reason for choosing this spot be something underground, a geological feature, or water source we haven't yet identified? Or what if the first ditch was dug to commemorate an event so culturally specific, like the birth of a mythical hero, that we could never guess it? Number 19, was there an original blueprint? You know, we think of Stonehenge as one thing, a single iconic design, but it wasn't. It was a project that was started, stopped, redesigned, and rebuilt over and over again for about 1,500 years. Like it's less like a cathedral and more like a modern city, like constantly being demolished and redeveloped. This raises a huge question. Was there ever a single grand plan, or were they just making it up as they went along? The first version of Stonehenge, around 3000 BC, had no stones. It was just a circular earthwork ditch and bank, with a ring of 56 pits just inside the bank, known as the Aubrey Holes. For a long time, archaeologists thought these holes were for timber posts, but excavations by Mike Parker Pearson's team in 2008 found that some of them held cremated human remains. It was, from its very beginning, a place for the dead. Then, around 2600 BC, everything changed. Someone decided to bring in the bluestones, dozens of them, from over 180 miles away in Wales. They were arranged in a double circle at the center. This was a massive undertaking, a huge investment of time and labor, but they weren't happy with it. Not long after, they took it all down. They dismantled the bluestone circles. Around 2500 BC, the main event started. The huge sarsen stones arrived from about 15 miles away. They were shaped into the iconic trilithons, the giant three-stone arches, and the outer circle with the lintels on top. This is the Stonehenge we recognize. They reused some of the bluestones, dotting them around the new sarsen structure. But even this wasn't the final version. Over the next few hundred years, the bluestones were moved around again and again, like furniture in a living room. Sometimes they were in a circle, sometimes a horseshoe. The final layout we see today is just a snapshot, the last configuration before the site was abandoned. So, was there a blueprint? It seems unlikely. No single architect could have overseen a project for 1,500 years. It suggests that each generation inherited the monument and reinterpreted it for their own purposes. Maybe a new dynasty of chiefs came to power and wanted to make their mark. Maybe a new religious idea swept the land, requiring a different layout for their rituals. The constant rebuilding shows a place that was alive with meaning, not a static monument built to a fixed plan. The famous archaeologist Richard Atkinson, who excavated at Stonehenge in the 1950s and 60s, proposed the classic three-phase model of construction. But modern archaeology shows it was far messier than that. There were at least 5 or 6 major stages and many smaller tweaks in between. It was a process of continuous creation, but this raises its own questions. If there was no master plan, how did they maintain the core astronomical alignments? The main axis is aligned to the midwinter sunset and midsummer sunrise. This was a feature from the sarsen stone phase onwards. Did they rediscover this alignment each time they rebuilt? Or was that one piece of the blueprint that was passed down through generations of priests or astronomers, even as the physical structure changed? It's as if they had a single sentence from an ancient instruction manual, and each generation had to build a new machine around it. What if the act of rebuilding was the whole point? What if the ritual was not just in using the finished temple, but in the communal labor of taking it down and putting it back up again? Could the constant changes have been part of a cyclical festival, a generational promise to the gods? And if each generation had its own vision, what profound cultural shift caused them to abandon small Welsh stones for giant local ones? Was it a religious revolution or a political takeover? Number 18, who were the builders? A unified culture or warring tribes. The scale of Stonehenge is breathtaking. Moving the stones, shaping them, and raising them would have required a huge organized workforce. This leads to a fundamental question about the society that built it. Was Neolithic Britain a unified, peaceful society able to draw on labor from across the island for a shared spiritual project? Or was the monument built by a powerful local tribe, perhaps using forced labor from conquered enemies? For a long time, the dominant image was of a single, unified, megalithic culture that stretched across Britain and even parts of Europe. The evidence for this is the similarity in monuments from the period. The stone circles, the henges, the tomb styles, they share a common architectural language. It suggests a shared set of beliefs and a lot of contact between different groups. The fact that the bluestones were brought all the way from the Preseli Hills in Wales to Salisbury Plain in England is often seen as the ultimate proof of this. It must have been a great pilgrimage, a collaborative effort between the people of Wales and the people of Wessex. This idea is supported by findings at Durrington Walls, the settlement where the builders are thought to have lived. Their excavations by the Stonehenge Riverside Project uncovered the remains of at least 1,000 houses, suggesting a population of several thousand people. This analysis of pig and cattle bones found at the site, published in a 2015 study in the journal Antiquity, showed that the animals were brought from all over Britain. Some came from as far away as Scotland. This wasn't a local farmer's market. It was a massive island-wide gathering. People were coming to Stonehenge for huge feasts and festivals and presumably to help with the construction. It points to a connected world, a shared culture, but there's another, darker possibility. Power. Building Stonehenge would have been an incredible display of a ruler's or a tribe's authority. The ability to command thousands of laborers, to feed them, to house them, and to direct their work over many years that speaks of a highly organized, hierarchical society. Perhaps Stonehenge wasn't a symbol of unity, but a symbol of domination. Consider the Amesbury archer, whose grave was discovered in 2002, just a few miles from Stonehenge. He was buried around 2300 BC, right when the Saracens were being erected. Isotope analysis of his teeth showed he grew up in the Alps, in modern-day Switzerland or Germany. He was buried with some of the earliest gold and copper objects ever found in Britain. He was clearly a very important, powerful man, and he was a foreigner. His presence suggests that Stonehenge was an international center, attracting powerful elites from across Europe. These elites may have been the ones directing the project, using their wealth and influence to control the local population. This leads to the question of slavery. Could Stonehenge have been built with forced labor? It's very difficult to find archaeological evidence for slavery. There are no chains or written records. But in a society capable of organizing on this scale, it's certainly a possibility. The sheer physical toll of the work would have been immense. Perhaps the feasts at Durrington Walls weren't for happy volunteers, but were a way of paying or controlling a conscripted workforce. The monument we see as a spiritual wonder could have been built on the backs of the oppressed. So, who were they? Were they a nation of pilgrims working together in a great act of faith? Or were they the subjects of a powerful king, an arch-druid, as the 18th century antiquarian William Stukeley imagined, who could command obedience and sacrifice? The evidence is tantalizingly ambiguous. What if both theories are true at different times? Could the initial Bluestone phase have been a collaborative spiritual project, only to be co-opted later by a powerful elite who brought in the giant Saracens to stamp their own authority on a sacred site? Was the arrival of the Amesbury archer and his metal-working technology the moment a peaceful culture was replaced by a more hierarchical, warlike one? Or could the stones themselves represent different tribes brought together in a fragile political alliance, with each stone a treaty in the whole circle of Parliament? Number 17, how do they organize a 1,500-year project? Building a house is a complex project. Building a skyscraper is a logistical nightmare. Building Stonehenge with Stone Age technology over a period of 1,500 years is almost incomprehensible. How do you manage a project when the people who start it will be dead for 1,000 years before it's finished? How do you pass on the knowledge, the plan, and the motivation through 50 generations? There was no writing. There were no architectural drawings. There were no project managers with spreadsheets. All the knowledge had to be passed down orally and through practice. This suggests an incredibly stable society with powerful institutions for preserving knowledge. These were likely held by a priestly class or a council of elders. They would have been the keepers of the traditions, the astronomers who knew the alignments, and the engineers who knew the techniques. Think about the specific skills required. You need geologists who know where to find the right kinds of stone. You need quarrymen who know how to split giant boulders from the bedrock. You need transport managers who can organize hundreds of people to move a 30-ton stone. You need skilled masons to shape the stone with incredible precision. You need astronomers to get the alignments right. And you need leaders who can command the respect and labor of thousands of people. None of this happens by accident. It requires specialization and long-term apprenticeship. A father would have taught his son, who taught his grandson, the specific craft of stone shaping or rope making. The evidence from Durrington Walls gives us a glimpse of the organization. The sheer scale of the settlement and the feasting suggests a central authority was in charge of logistics. Someone had to coordinate bringing in thousands of pigs and cattle from all over the country to feed the workforce. This wasn't a small-time operation, it was state-level planning. Archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson estimates that the feasts at Durrington Walls could have fed up to 4,000 people at a time. The effort to feed the builders was almost as impressive as the building itself. But what about the 1,500-year timeline? This is the truly baffling part. Cultures change, religions evolve, dynasties fall. How did the central idea of Stonehenge survive all that? The site was radically altered several times. They switched from using blue stones to saracens. They tore down circles and built horseshoes, yet The core purpose of the site as a major ceremonial center on this exact spot persisted. One theory is that the site's power was self-perpetuating. Once it was established as a sacred place, it became too important to abandon. Each new group of people who came to power in the region had to engage with Stonehenge. They would either add to it or remodel it to fit their own beliefs, but they couldn't ignore it. It was the spiritual center of the world they knew. To control Stonehenge was to control the land. This is very different from, say, building a medieval cathedral, which might take a century or two, but was based on written plans and a continuous church hierarchy. The organization of Stonehenge had to be more fluid, based on memory and tradition. It's a testament to the power of oral culture. The stories and instructions must have been incredibly strong to survive for so long. What if the project wasn't continuous? What if there were long periods, hundreds of years, where Stonehenge lay dormant, only to be rediscovered and re-energized by a new generation? Could the plan have been lost and then reinvented based on the ruins? And if a priestly class held the knowledge, what happened if their line died out? Did someone have to reverse engineer the astronomical alignments from scratch? Or what if the long-term plan was built into the stars themselves, an idea so simple and powerful face the winter sunset set that it could never be truly forgotten? Number 16, where did the giant sarsen stones come from? The massive uprights and lintels of Stonehenge, the ones that create the iconic silhouette, are made of sarsen stone. It's a type of silicified sandstone, incredibly hard and durable. Some of them weigh over 40 tons and stand 30 feet tall. For centuries, their origin was a bit of a mystery. People assumed they were local, but local is a relative term when you're talking about a 40-ton rock. The general consensus was that they came from the Marlborough Downs, a region about 20 miles north of Stonehenge. This area is littered with sarsen stones. It's the remains of a silica-rich layer of sand laid down millions of years ago. But the Marlborough Downs is a big place. Could we get more specific? The breakthrough came in 2020. A study led by David Nash from the University of Brighton finally pinpointed the exact source. The story of how they did it is a small detective story in itself. Back in the 1950s, during repair work, a core sample was drilled from one of the stones, Stone 58. A man who worked on the project, Robert Phillips, kept the core as a souvenir. For 60 years, it traveled with him, from England to the United States. In 2018, on the eve of his 90th birthday, he decided to return it to English heritage. This returned core was a scientific goldmine. Because it was protected from the elements, its chemical makeup was pristine. Nash and his team were able to analyze it using X-ray fluorescence spectrometry. This gave them a precise geochemical fingerprint of Stone 58. They then went and tested all the sarsen outcrops in southern Britain, looking for a match. They found it. The fingerprint of Stone 58 perfectly matched a location called West Woods, which is about 15 miles north of Stonehenge. It's an area that was known to have sarsens, but it had never been definitively linked. The study, published in the journal Science Advances, concluded that it was overwhelmingly likely that West Woods was the source for most, if not all, of the giant sarsens. This discovery is huge. It changes our picture of the construction process. We now have a starting point and an end point. We can trace the 15-mile journey. We can walk the route and try to figure out the challenges they faced. It's no longer a vague from the north problem. It's a from West Woods to Stonehenge problem. But it also raises new questions. Why West Woods? There were other sarsen sources, some slightly closer. Was there something special about the stones from this particular place? Were they considered to have a unique spiritual quality? Or was it purely a practical decision? Maybe the stones at West Woods were bigger or shaped in a way that made them easier to extract. And how did they find them? Did Neolithic prospectors spend years mapping out all the sarsen fields in the region, testing their quality before settling on West Woods? The level of geological knowledge they must have possessed is impressive. They weren't just picking up random rocks. They were selecting the absolute best material for a monument that was meant to last forever. They were quarrying for eternity. Now that we know where the sarsens came from, can we find the evidence of the quarrying? Are there negative spaces in West Woods where giant stones have been removed? What tools did they use to split these behemoths from the ground? And why did they leave so many other sarsens behind? Was the project halted unexpectedly, leaving a stockpile of raw materials forever unused? And number 15, how did they pinpoint the bluestone quarries in Wales? If the origin of the sarsens was a puzzle, the origin of the bluestones is a full-blown mystery epic. And bluestone isn't a single geological term, it's a catch-all name for the smaller stones at Stonehenge, most of which are made of spotted dolerite, a volcanic rock. They get a bluish tinge when they're wet or freshly broken. They are completely alien to the geology of Salisbury Plain. As early as 1923, the geologist H. Thomas correctly identified their source, the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, West Wales. That's a journey of around 180 miles as the crow flies. How on earth did a Neolithic culture, with no maps, identify a specific type of rock in a specific range of hills, and then decide to transport it across land and possibly water to build their temple? For decades, the search was on for the exact quarries. It's one thing to know the stones are from the Preseli Hills. It's another to find the very spots they were extracted from. A team of archaeologists and geologists, including Mike Parker Pearson, Richard Bevins, and Rob Ixer, have spent years on this. They took samples from the bluestones at Stonehenge and meticulously compared their mineral and chemical composition to rock outcrops all over the Preselis. In 2011, they hit the jackpot. They announced they had found the source of one of the rhyolite bluestones. It was a crag called Craig Rose y Feline. Then, in 2015, they found the main source for the spotted dolerite bluestones, a series of outcrops at a place called Carn Godog. They didn't just find the right rock type, they found what appear to be ancient quarries. There are clear signs of human activity: stone wedges, hammer stones, and man-made platforms. There are even vertical pillars of dolerite that seem to have been partially separated from the rock face, as if the workers just packed up and left in the middle of a job. The radiocarbon dating of the quarry sites suggests activity there around 3000 BC, which is centuries before the bluestones first appear at Stonehenge. This is a staggering discovery. It connects two places 180 miles apart with physical evidence. But it deepens the mystery. How did they know those specific rocks were there? The Preseli Hills are not a unique geological wonder from a distance. You have to be there, on the ground, to recognize the special properties of the spotted dolerite. One idea is that the area was already sacred. Perhaps the bluestones were part of a local stone circle in Wales that was later dismantled and moved to Salisbury Plain as a gesture of political union or conquest? Mike Parker Pearson has been searching for signs of this first Stonehenge in Wales, so far without definitive success. Another theory is that the stones were believed to have magical or healing properties. The medieval writer Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote in the 12th century that Merlin brought the stones from Ireland because they were magical healing stones. While the geography is wrong, the folk memory of them being special might be right. The area around the Preseli Hills is rich in ancient tombs and monuments. It was clearly an important Neolithic landscape in its own right. Maybe the Stonehenge builders didn't just want any stone. They wanted those stones imbued with the ancestral power of a sacred mountain. But how did a group from southern England even know about them? Was there trade or intermarriage or long-distance travel that we are underestimating? The journey itself would have been perilous. It suggests a connection between these two distant communities that was incredibly strong and enduring. Why did they go to so much trouble for these relatively small 2-ton stones when they had access to the giant 40-ton sarsens locally? What was so important about bluestone? And the biggest question of all, raised by the early dating of the quarries, did they really quarry the stones around 3000 BC and then store them somewhere for 400 years before moving them to Stonehenge? Or were they used in a local Welsh monument first, a monument we have yet to find? Number 14, did they really drag stones 180 miles overland? Okay, so we know where the bluestones came from, the Preseli Hills, and we know where they ended up, Stonehenge. The question that has obsessed people for centuries is, how did they get from A to B? The journey covers about 180 miles. It crosses mountains, hills, forests, rivers, and swamps. And they were moving dozens of stones, each weighing about 2 tons, the weight of a car. The classic theory is the overland route. This is the one you see in documentaries. A huge team of people, maybe 100 or more, pulling a single stone on a wooden sledge. The sledge might be moving over a track of logs, acting as rollers. It's a vision of brute force, sweat, and chanting. An epic feat of human determination. Experiments have been done to test this. In 2000, as part of a Millennium Project, a group of volunteers in Pembrokeshire attempted to move a 2-ton bluestone using only technology available in the Neolithic. They managed it. They pulled it on a sledge overland and even loaded it onto a raft. But they only moved it a few miles on relatively easy terrain. Scaling that up to 180 miles of difficult landscape is another matter entirely. The logistics would be astronomical. You'd need to clear a path, you'd need to feed and house the pullers for months, maybe years. The main proponent of a primarily overland route is archaeologist Jeffrey Wainwright. He, along with Timothy Darville, believes the bluestones were seen as having healing properties and that the arduous overland journey was a kind of pilgrimage. The difficulty was part of the point. They argued that the route would have followed ancient trackways along the ridges of the Welsh mountains and then across southern England. The computer modeling has been used to try and map the most efficient path. In 2016, a team from University College London published a study using a GIS model to calculate the least cost pathway for moving heavy loads. Their model suggested a route that was not the most direct, but the one that avoided the steepest slopes and most difficult terrain. It still involved a massive amount of overland hauling, but the sheer scale of the effort makes many people doubt it. Could a society really afford to divert that much manpower for that long? The risk of failure would be huge. A broken sledge, a snapped rope, a stone lost in a bogside, each one would be a disaster. And they had to do it not just once, but over 80 times. And there's a big problem with the overland theory, a lack of evidence. If hundreds of people were dragging stones along a 180-mile route, you would expect them to leave some trace behind. A lost tool, a temporary campsite, a broken piece of stone. So far, despite years of searching, no definitive archaeological evidence of this massive transport operation has been found anywhere along the proposed land routes. It's a ghost trail. Is it possible we are fundamentally underestimating their strength and organization? Or are we just looking in the wrong places? Could the evidence have been erased by 5,000 years of farming and development? Or is the lack of evidence telling us that the overland theory, as epic as it sounds, is simply wrong? What if the real journey was even more audacious? Number 13. Could they have used the sea and rivers? The overland route for the bluestones is a logistical nightmare. So what's the alternative? Water. Look at a map of Britain. The Preseli Hills are near the coast of Wales. Stonehenge is not far from the River Avon, which flows into the Bristol Channel. The idea that they used a combination of sea and river transport is very appealing. It avoids many of the problems of the land route. The theory goes like this. The stones were quarried in the Preseli Hills and dragged a few miles down to the sea at Milford Haven. There they were loaded onto rafts or boats. These vessels then sailed along the treacherous coast of South Wales, around Land's End in Cornwall, and then along the south coast of England. Finally, they would have turned up the River Avon, bringing the stones to within a couple miles of Stonehenge. This is an equally epic journey, but it relies on a different kind of skill. Not just brute force, but sophisticated seamanship. They would have needed sturdy, seaworthy vessels capable of carrying a 2-ton load. They would have needed an intimate knowledge of tides, currents, and weather. The seas around this part of Britain are notoriously rough. It would have been an incredibly risky voyage. What kind of boats did they have? We don't have any remains of Neolithic seagoing ships, but we know from other evidence that they were capable of sea travel. People had been crossing the English Channel for thousands of years. They colonized the islands of Orkney and Shetland. They must have had effective boats. They were likely made of wood frames covered with animal hides, similar to a large Irish curragh. In 2016, a team of students from University College London built a replica Neolithic boat and successfully floated a 1-ton stone on it in a lake. It proved the concept was viable. However, a calm lake is very different from the Bristol Channel. The sea route also has its critics. It's a very long and roundabout journey, probably over 350 miles. Why sail all that way around the Southwest Peninsula when you could cut across it? Some have proposed a hybrid route. They suggest the stones were floated on rafts up the Bristol Channel and then taken up rivers like the Frome before being dragged a shorter distance overland. This avoids the dangerous trip around Land's End. One of the most intriguing and controversial theories comes from Brian John, a geographer who has spent years studying the geology of the Preseli Hills. He argues that humans didn't move the bluestones at all. He believes the stones were carried from Wales to Salisbury Plain by glaciers during the last ice age, thousands of years before Stonehenge was built. He suggests the Stonehenge builders simply found the bluestones lying on the plain and gathered them up. It would certainly solve the transport problem. However, most archaeologists reject the glacier theory. The distribution of the bluestones is too concentrated. If a glacier had dropped them, you'd expect to find them scattered all over the region, not just at Stonehenge. Also, the discovery of the actual quarries at Carngodog and Craig Ross Weeffeline, with evidence of human working, is very strong proof against the glacial transport idea. So we are left with the water, a grand voyage that speaks of a Neolithic society with a mastery of the sea. It's a romantic and compelling image. But, just like the overland route, it suffers from a lack of hard evidence. No sunken bluestone carrying boats have ever been found. No remains of Neolithic harbors have been identified. It remains a powerful but unproven theory. What if they used a route we haven't even considered, a combination of land and inland waterways that are now gone? Could the landscape have been different with more navigable rivers than today? And if they were such master sailors, why do we find so little other evidence of their maritime culture? Did the skills and the boats exist only for this one sacred purpose? Number 12, how many people did it take to move one stone? Whether by land or by sea, moving the stones required people. A lot of them. But how many? Trying to calculate the exact manpower needed is a fascinating exercise in experimental archaeology. It's a way of getting a real physical sense of the challenge they faced. Let's start with the Sarsens. The largest of these weigh over 40 tons. They were moved about 15 miles from West Woods. The route is not flat, it involves hills and valleys. The most common theory is that they were placed on a wooden sledge and pulled with ropes. The sledge might have run on a track of wooden rollers to reduce friction. In the 1990s, engineer Julian Richards led an experiment for a BBC documentary. His team built a replica sledge and tried to move a 40-ton concrete block. It was a disaster. The sledge broke. They couldn't get enough grip. It showed how incredibly difficult the task was. A more recent estimate comes from Barney Harris, an archaeologist at University College London. In 2018, he did a detailed analysis based on modern pulling experiments and data on human physical capabilities. For a 30-ton sarsen stone on a sledge moving on a relatively flat, lubricated track, he calculated it would take at least 500 people to pull it. If you add in the people needed to, clear the path, lay the track, supervise, and provide food and water, you are looking at well over 600 people for a single stone. And that's on the flat. Going uphill would require even more, maybe 1,000 people. Going downhill was just as dangerous. You'd need teams of people at the back holding the stone with ropes to stop it from running away and crushing everyone in its path. It would have been a slow, painstaking process. Harris estimates they might have moved at a speed of about half a mile per day. The 15-mile journey from West Woods could have taken a month. Now for the bluestones. They are smaller, around 2 tons each, but they had to be moved 180 miles. Using similar calculations, moving a 2-ton stone on a sledge overland would need about 50 to 60 people. This is a much more manageable number, like a single community or a large family group could perhaps have handled it. This might support the idea of the bluestone journey being a pilgrimage, with different groups each responsible for transporting one stone. But these numbers are just estimates. They depend on a lot of assumptions. What was the quality of their ropes? How effective were the sledges? What was the terrain really like 5,000 years ago? A little bit of mud or a steep rocky patch could bring the whole operation to a halt. The social organization required is as impressive as the physical effort. You can't just get 500 people to pull on a rope. Someone has to be in charge. There has to be a rhythm, a chant to coordinate the pulling. There has to be a plan. It suggests a society with strong leadership and a shared sense of purpose. Whether that purpose was driven by religious devotion or by fear of a powerful chief, we don't know. But what if our assumptions about the technology are wrong? What if they had a more efficient method we haven't thought of? Some have suggested they used teams of oxen. A single ox is much stronger than a human. A team of 20 oxen could potentially do the work of 200 people. We know they had domesticated cattle. Is there any reason they wouldn't have used them for traction? But again, there's no direct evidence. No ox goads, no yokes found along the route, just another frustrating blank. Could they have used a system of levers and capstans to inch the stones forward, requiring fewer people but more time? What if the workforce was seasonal, with farmers working on the stones during the winter months when there was less agricultural work to do? And how did they deal with injuries? A 40-ton stone that slips is a terrifying weapon. Was the building of Stonehenge paid for with a constant toll of human life? Number 11, What did they use for ropes and sledges? So we have hundreds of people ready to pull, but what are they pulling with? And what is the stone sitting on? The whole operation depends on two key pieces of technology, the sledge and the rope. Neither survives in the archaeological record. Wood and plant fiber rot away over 5,000 years. So we have to infer what they used based on the materials they had available and what we know about their skills. The sledges were almost certainly made of wood. They would have needed large, strong timbers to support a 40-ton sarsen. An oak would have been the obvious choice. It's incredibly strong and was abundant in the ancient forests of Britain. The sledge would have likely been a simple A-frame or H-frame design with two large runners and several crossbeams. The stone would be lashed to this frame, but how did they make the sledge? They had no saws. They would have had to fell giant oak trees using stone axes. Then they would have had to split the logs into planks using wooden or antler wedges. This was a hugely time-consuming and skilled process. Just making the sledge would have been a major construction project in itself. And they would have needed many of them, as they would surely have broken under the immense strain. Then there are the ropes. You can't pull a 40-ton stone with just any old bit of string. You need immensely strong, thick ropes. What could they make them from? The most likely candidates are plant fibers. The fibers from the bark of trees, like lime and elm, can be processed and twisted into incredibly strong cordage. Experiments have shown that Neolithic-style lime bark rope is surprisingly strong. A rope just an inch thick can have a breaking strain of over a ton. But to pull a 40-ton sarsen, you'd need a lot of it. You'd need multiple thick ropes, each held by a team of pullers. The amount of labor required just to make the ropes is staggering. Someone would have had to harvest the bark from thousands of trees. Then the bark has to be soaked for a long time, a process called retting, to separate the fibers. Then the fibers have to be processed and twisted into cord. It's a craft that requires a lot of knowledge and skill. Some have suggested an alternative to plant fiber leather. Long strips of cowhide could be twisted into rope. Leather is very strong, but it might stretch under load, which would be a problem. And again, the number of cows you would need to sacrifice just for their hides would be enormous. It would represent a huge part of the community's wealth. So, the forgotten heroes of the Stonehenge story are the lumberjacks, the sledge builders, and the rope makers. Their work was just as critical as the people pulling the stones, but it leaves even less of a trace. We see the final product, the stone circle, but the vast infrastructure of wood and fiber that made it possible has vanished completely. We are left to guess at the details. Did they use grease or animal fat to lubricate the sledge runners? Did the sledges have some kind of steering mechanism? How did they attach the ropes to the sledge in a way that wouldn't snap or slip? These are not trivial questions. The success or failure of the whole project rested on getting these small technical details right. Could they have used a material for ropes that we haven't even considered, a plant that is now rare or extinct? What if the sledges weren't wood but were built on a different principle entirely, perhaps using a cage of woven branches? And is it possible that the ropes and sledges were considered sacred objects in themselves, ritually destroyed after each stone was moved, which is why we find no trace of them? Number 10. How did they shape hard stone with primitive tools? Moving the stones was only half the battle. Once they got to the site, the sarsens had to be shaped. And the level of stoneworking at Stonehenge is unlike anything else from the period in Britain. The stones are not just rough boulders. They were carefully dressed and finished. They have features that are incredibly sophisticated for a culture that had no metal tools. The main tool for shaping sarsen stone was another stone. That's it. Sarsen is so hard that flint axes, the cutting tool of the day, would just shatter against it. The builders used large, heavy sarsen boulders, known as mauls or hammerstones, to pound the surfaces of the stones. They would systematically smash away at the face of the rock, bit by bit, until it was flat. It's a process of pulverizing, not cutting. You can still see the evidence of this on the stones today. Many of them have a rippled or pocked texture, the result of thousands upon thousands of blows from hammerstones. Archaeologists have found huge numbers of these mauls around Stonehenge, some weighing up to 60 pounds. It must have been deafening, back-breaking work. A team of masons would have stood on wooden platforms, pounding away at the giant stones for months or even years. The precision they achieved is amazing. They made the surfaces of the stones flat. They made the uprights taper towards the top, an architectural trick called entasis, which makes them look straighter and more imposing from the ground. They even made sure the lintels that sit on top of the outer circle are slightly curved so that the full circle looks perfectly level. This is a level of refinement you would expect from the Greeks, not from Neolithic Britons. How did they check their work? How did they get the surfaces so flat without modern levels and straight edges? They probably used simple but effective tools like plumb, bobs, a weight on a string tool to check that the sides were vertical. They may have used long straight pieces of wood to check for flatness. It was a process of constant patient checking and correcting. The most incredible features are the joints. The builders were not content to just balance the lintels on top of the uprights. They carved joints to lock them together. The uprights have bumps on top called tenons. The lintels have corresponding holes called mortises carved into their undersides. The lintel was lowered, so the tenon fits snugly into the mortise, creating a strong, stable joint. This is a technique straight out of woodworking. And that's not all. The lintels of the outer circle were also joined to each other. They used a tongue and groove joint. One end of a lintel has a vertical ridge carved into it, and the next lintel has a groove for it to fit into. This locked the whole circle together into a solid ring. Carving these joints with nothing but stone mauls is mind-boggling. How did they hollow out the mortise holes? They would have had to pound and grind away, millimeter by millimeter. It would have taken an incredible amount of time and skill. One mistake, one misplaced blow, and you could crack the stone, ruining years of work. Why go to all this trouble? Why not just use rough, unshaped stones like at other stone circles such as Avebury? It shows a desire for order, for perfection, for permanence. They weren't just building a thing, they were making a statement. They were treating stone as if it were a finer, more permanent version of wood. What did they use for the finer finishing work after the mauls had done their job? Did they spend hours rubbing the surfaces with smaller stones and sand to get them smooth? And how did they measure and mark out the positions for the mortise and tenon joints with such accuracy? Did they have a standard unit of measurement, a Neolithic yardstick that has now been lost? Number 9, why copy woodworking joints in stone? The use of mortise and tenon and tongue and groove joints at Stonehenge is one of its most remarkable and strangest features. As we've seen, this is a technique used in carpentry to join pieces of wood. Applying it to stone, especially on this scale, is unheard of in Neolithic Europe. It's a classic example of what archaeologists call skeuomorphism, making a new material look like an older, more familiar one. Think of a modern electric car that has a fake front grille just because we're used to cars having grills. So why did the Stonehenge builders carve their stones to look like they were made of wood? The most common explanation is that they were recreating a familiar and sacred design in a new, more permanent material. It's possible that for centuries their most important temples and monuments were made of wood. Woodhenge, a monument near Durrington Walls, was a massive structure of concentric timber posts. It was probably a very important site. Perhaps Stonehenge was a project to build a super Woodhenge, a version of their wooden temples that would never rot, that would last for eternity. They were so used to thinking in terms of wooden construction that when they started working with stone, they used the same techniques. They didn't have a separate architectural language for stone, yet they were inventing it, and they started by copying what they knew. This idea is supported by the work of Mike Parker Pearson. His theory of the two landscapes, that the land of the living wood at Durrington Walls and the land of the dead stone at Stonehenge, fits perfectly with this. Stonehenge was the stone counterpart to the wooden temples. It was a house for the ancestral spirits, and it was built to look like the wooden houses of the living, but rendered in the eternal medium of stone. This also explains the immense effort they put into shaping the stones. If they were just trying to build a strong structure, they could have done it much more simply. But they weren't just building, they were translating. They were meticulously copying every detail of a timber original. The tapered uprights, the curved lintels, the complex joints, and these might all be features of the lost wooden temples they were trying to immortalize. It's a beautiful and compelling theory. It gives us a window into their minds. We can see them grappling with a new technology and falling back on old traditions. It suggests a deep reverence for their ancestors and a powerful desire to connect with them. But it's still an interpretation. There's no definitive proof. We have not found the original wooden monument that Stonehenge is supposedly a copy of. It's possible the joints have a purely functional purpose that we are not fully appreciating. Maybe they discovered through trial and error that these joints were the best way to make the structure resistant to wind or ground tremors. Perhaps it wasn't about copying wood at all, but about solving a difficult engineering problem. Or could the reason be even more symbolic? What if wood and stone represented two different elements of their cosmology, a male and female principle, or sky and earth? By joining them together, by making stone behave like wood, were they performing a powerful ritual act, a magical fusion of two different worlds? The truth is, we don't know why they chose to work this way. It's one of the clearest signs we have of their intentions, but we still can't quite read the message. What if the woodworking joints were a sign of a new culture arriving, one that was skilled in carpentry, who then applied their skills to the local tradition of stone building? Could this have been a status symbol, a way for the builders to show off their technical prowess? Or what if the meaning is simpler? What if the person who designed it just happened to be a carpenter, and this was the only way they knew how to think? Number 8. How did they lift 30-ton lintels into place? So the stones are moved and shaped. The uprights are in place. Now comes what seems like the most impossible task of all, lifting the lintels. These are the horizontal stones that sit on top of the uprights. The ones on the outer circle weigh about 7 tons. The ones on the giant central trilithons weigh over 30 tons. They had to be lifted over 13 feet in the air and placed with pinpoint accuracy to engage the mortise and tenon joints. How, with no cranes and no machinery, do you lift a 30-ton block of stone that high? This is one of the most debated questions in Stonehenge archaeology. The most widely accepted theory is that they used a combination of timber and earth. One method involves building a giant wooden scaffold. A huge, sturdy A-frame structure could be built around 2 uprights. Then, using a system of ropes and levers, a team of people would slowly winch the lintel up the side of the scaffold. It would be a slow, terrifying process. The amount of timber required for the scaffolding would be enormous. The ropes would be under incredible strain, but it is in principle possible. The other main theory, and the one favored by many, is that they used an earthen ramp. They would have piled up huge amounts of earth, chalk, and turf against the uprights, creating a long, gentle slope. The lintel would then be pulled up the ramp on a sledge with rollers. Once it was at the top, it would be levered sideways into position over the tenons on the uprights. After the lintel was in place, the ramp would be removed. This method has a lot of advantages. It's stable and relatively safe compared to a rickety wooden scaffold. The main resource it requires is labor to move all the earth. But this also has its problems. The ramp would have to be huge. To get a gentle enough slope to pull a 30-ton stone up, the ramp might need to be hundreds of feet long. Building and then removing these ramps for every single lintel would have been a monumental task in itself. Some have suggested that instead of a ramp, they built a crib, a giant platform of crisscrossing timbers, raising it layer by layer with the stone on top until it reached the right height. In 2014, a student at the University of Salford, Andrew Young, built a 1/12 scale model to test the crib theory. He successfully used small levers to raise a model lintel, layer by layer, on a wooden platform. It worked. It was slow and patient work, but it showed that a small team of people could, with the right technique, lift a huge weight. This method doesn't require vast numbers of pullers or massive earthworks. It just requires time and precision. Whichever method they used, scaffold, ramp, or crib, it was an act of supreme engineering skill and courage. The final moment, when the lintel was lowered the last few inches onto the tenons, must have been incredibly tense. One slip could have destroyed the lintel, the uprights, and the people working below. The precision required is phenomenal. We have no direct evidence to tell us which method they used. No remains of the scaffolds, ramps, or cribs have survived. We are forced to rely on logic and experiment. It's possible they used different methods for different parts of the monument. Perhaps the smaller outer circle lintels were lifted with scaffolds, while the giant trilithon lintels required a massive ramp. What if they had a technique that is completely lost to us? A sophisticated understanding of counterweights and levers that allowed them to lift the stones with surprising ease. Could they have built a temporary wooden structure on one side of the uprights, and then used a seesaw or lever mechanism with dozens of people acting as a counterweight to pivot the lintel into place? And what was the accident rate? How many people died in the process of raising these stones? Number 7, did they intentionally engineer the sound? We think of Stonehenge as a visual spectacle, but what did it sound like? In recent years, a new field called archaeoacoustics has started to explore the soundscapes of ancient sites. And the findings at Stonehenge are fascinating. It seems the builders may have been shaping not just stone, but sound itself. The key is the circular arrangement of the stones. A ring of solid objects can have very strange acoustic effects. In 2012, researchers from the University of Salford, led by Professor Trevor Cox, built a 1/12 scale model of Stonehenge as it might have looked in its prime. This model, which they called Stonehenge Lego, allowed them to conduct acoustic tests in a controlled environment. They found that the circle of stones created a space with a very distinct sound. It blocked out sound from the outside, creating a quieter, more intimate environment within the circle. It also created reverberation. Sounds made inside the circle, like a voice or a drum, would have a slight echo, lasting for about half a second. This is not a long echo like you'd get in a cathedral, but it's enough to make speech sound more impressive and music sound richer. The circle of stones effectively acted as a prehistoric concert hall. This effect would have been even stronger when the monument was complete, with all 30 lintels of the outer sarsen circle in place, creating a solid, continuous wall of stone. Anyone standing inside would have felt acoustically separated from the outside world. This would have been perfect for rituals, ceremonies, and secret gatherings. The words of a priest or the beat of a drum would have been enhanced, made to sound more powerful and otherworldly. But did they design it this way on purpose? Or is the acoustic effect just a happy accident, a side effect of building a big stone circle? This is very hard to prove, but there is other evidence that suggests Neolithic people were very interested in sound. A study in 2014 by researchers from the Royal College of Art in London looked at the bluestones. They found that many of them have unusual acoustic properties. When struck with a hammerstone, they ring like a bell or a gong. They are a form of lithophone, or rock gong. The researchers went to the bluestone quarries at Carngodog in Wales and tested the rocks there. They found that many of the rock pillars in the quarry also rang when struck. This raises an amazing possibility. What if the bluestones were chosen not just for their color or their origin, but for their sound? Perhaps the builders went around the Preseli Hills, tapping on rocks, looking for the ones that had the best musical tone. Stonehenge might not just have been a temple and an observatory, it might also have been a giant musical instrument. The rituals there could have involved playing the stones, creating a symphony of percussive sound to accompany chants or dances. If this is true, it completely changes our understanding of the monument. It wasn't a silent, static place. It was a place of dynamic sound and music. The experience of being at Stonehenge during a ceremony would have been a full sensory immersion. Could the specific layout of the stones have been designed to create particular acoustic sweet spots or dead zones? Was the horseshoe shape of the central trilithons intended to act like a modern orchestral shell, projecting sound out towards an audience? And if the stones were musical instruments, what kind of tunes did they play? What did a Neolithic ritual actually sound like? Number 6, what do the hidden dagger and axe carvings mean? For thousands of years, the stones of Stonehenge kept a secret. Hidden in plain sight on the surface of some of the sarsens are faint carvings. They are so weathered and subtle that for centuries nobody noticed them. It was only in 1953 that archaeologist Richard Atkinson spotted them while taking photographs in the low, raking light of a summer evening. There are over 100 of these carvings. The most common motifs are axe heads and a single dagger. They are found clustered on 3 of the sarsens in the inner horseshoe. The axe heads are of a type that was common in the Bronze Age, around 1750 BC. The dagger is of a very specific type, known as a Mycenaean dagger, from the culture of ancient Greece. The discovery of these carvings caused a huge stir. The presence of a Mycenaean-style dagger seemed to be concrete proof of a link between Stonehenge and the great civilizations of the Mediterranean. For a while, the popular theory was that a Greek architect must have visited Britain and been involved in the final stages of Stonehenge's construction. It tied the monument into the wider world of the Bronze Age. However, more recent analysis has questioned this link. While the dagger is similar to Mycenaean examples, it's not an exact match. It could be a local British design that just happens to look similar. The axe head carvings are much more common. They depict a type of bronze axe that was a high-status object in Bronze Age Britain. They were symbols of power and authority. So, what do the carvings mean? They were added to the monument long after the sarsens were erected, perhaps as much as 700 years later. It seems that a later generation of people felt the need to add their own symbols to this ancient, sacred place. One theory is that they are memorials. Perhaps great chieftains or warriors were buried at Stonehenge, and an axe was carved on the stone to represent each one. It would make Stonehenge a kind of national mausoleum, a stone memorial to the great and good of the Bronze Age. The dagger could represent a particularly famous or powerful leader. Another idea is that they are votive offerings, gifts to the gods or the spirits of the ancestors who resided at the monument. Instead of leaving a real bronze axe, which was an incredibly valuable object, you could carve a picture of one on the stone as a permanent offering. It was a way of showing devotion and respect. The position of the carvings is also interesting. They are mostly on the interfaces of the stones, not easily visible from the outside. And they are at about eye level. This suggests they were meant for people participating in ceremonies inside the circle. They were part of the intimate, sacred experience of being within the temple. Recent laser scanning work, part of the Breaking the Surface project in 2012, has revealed many more carvings than were previously known and has shown them in incredible detail. But it hasn't solved the mystery of their meaning. They remain a silent, coded message from a later chapter in Stonehenge's long life. Why were the carvings only made on a few of the stones? Was there something special about those particular trilithons? Could the carvings be a form of signature marking the stones that a particular tribe or clan was responsible for? Or what if they are not symbols of power at all, but graffiti left by bored guards or teenage rebels of the Bronze Age? Number 5, were the stones meant to be perfect rectangles? As we look at the Sarsens and we see massive, roughly rectangular blocks, we are impressed by the skill it took to shape them. But what if their goal was even more ambitious than we realize? What if they were trying to create something that looked perfect, not just from one angle, but from every angle? A fascinating theory explored by people like the engineer Tom Goskar suggests that the builders used subtle visual tricks to create an optical illusion of perfection. The best example is the slight tapering of the uprights, a feature known as entasis. If you make a tall column perfectly straight, it can sometimes look like it gets thinner in the middle. The ancient Greeks knew this, and they made the columns of the Parthenon bulge slightly in the middle to counteract this effect and make them look perfectly straight. The builders of Stonehenge seem to have discovered the same trick 2,000 years earlier. They made their uprights wider at the bottom than the top, which makes them appear straighter and more stable to the human eye. Then there are the lintels of the outer circle. As we mentioned, they are not straight. They are carefully shaped to follow a perfect curve. If they had used straight lintels, the circle would have looked like a 30-sided polygon. By curving them, they made the top of the monument look like a true, smooth circle. This is an incredible level of architectural sophistication. It shows they weren't just thinking about structure, they were thinking about aesthetics. They cared deeply about how the monument looked, how it was perceived by the viewer. They were masters of perspective. This also suggests that the slightly battered and uneven look of the stones today is misleading. When they were new, they would have been much crisper and more uniform. Some researchers believe the surfaces were originally finished to a bright, almost white color. The Sarsen stone has a pale gray crust, but underneath it can be a brilliant white. By pounding off the outer layer, they would have revealed this bright interior. A brand new Stonehenge would have gleamed in the sun, a stunning circle of white against the green of the plain. But did they succeed in their quest for perfection? Some stones are more carefully shaped than others. Some of the joints are a bit sloppy. Was this because their skills varied, or did they run out of time? Or was a certain amount of roughness part of the design? This idea of visual correction and perfectionism raises so many questions. How did they figure out these optical tricks? Was it through generations of trial and error? Did they build scale models to test their ideas? The level of planning required is immense. You can't just improvise entasis. It has to be part of the design from the very beginning. It forces us to reevaluate the intelligence and the artistic sensibility of the people who built it. They were not just brutish laborers, they were artists and architects of the highest order. Could the stones have been painted or decorated in ways we can no longer see? Did the different finishes on the stones have a symbolic meaning? And if they were such perfectionists, why did they leave some of the stones, particularly the blue stones, in a much rougher, more natural state? Was this a deliberate contrast between the wildness of the ancestral Welsh stones and the civilized order of the local Sarsens? Number 4, how did they get the astronomy so right? Of all the mysteries of Stonehenge, the one that has captured the public imagination the most is its connection to the sky. The main axis of the monument is aligned with the solstices. If you stand in the center of the circle on the longest day of the year, the summer solstice, you will see the sun rise directly over a stone outside the main circle, known as the heel stone. If you look in the opposite direction on the shortest day, the midwinter solstice, you will see the sun set perfectly between the uprights of the tallest trilithon. This cannot be a coincidence. The alignment is too precise. The builders of Stonehenge were accomplished astronomers. They had a deep understanding of the sun's annual cycle. This was not just a temple, it was a calendar, an observatory, and a machine for connecting with the cosmos. This basic solstice alignment was first pointed out by the 18th century antiquarian William Stukeley. But in the 1960s, an astronomer named Gerald Hawkins took things much further. In his controversial book Stonehenge Decoded, he used an early computer to analyze all the possible alignments at Stonehenge. He claimed to have found dozens of them, not just to the sun but also to the moon and even bright stars. He argued that Stonehenge was a sophisticated astronomical computer capable of predicting eclipses. Most archaeologists were, and still are, skeptical of Hawkins' more elaborate claims. With so many stones and so many possible sightlines, it's easy to find apparent alignments that are just a matter of chance. The more you look, the more patterns you will see, whether they were intended or not. However, the main solstice alignment is undeniable. It's built into the very bones of the structure, and it seems to have been the most important one. The evidence from the feasting at Durrington Walls suggests that the biggest gatherings happened in the winter. This points to the midwinter sunset, not the midsummer sunrise, being the main event of the year. It was a time of darkness, but also of hope. The solstice marked the moment the sun turned around and the days started to get longer again. It was a festival of rebirth. How did they achieve such accuracy? They had no telescopes, no complex measuring instruments. They did it through patient observation over many, many years. A group of sky watchers, perhaps a priestly class, would have marked the position of the sunrise and sunset every day. They would have used simple wooden posts to track the sun's movement along the horizon. Over time, they would have been able to pinpoint the northernmost and southernmost points of the sun's journey to the solstices with great precision. Once they had this knowledge, they could lay out their monument to immortalize it in stone. The process probably took generations. It represents a huge intellectual investment. This was a society that was deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world. Their survival depended on knowing the seasons, and they built their greatest temple to celebrate that knowledge. But how deep did their knowledge go? Was the simple solstice alignment the extent of it, or was Hawkins right that there is more to find? Some researchers, like the astronomer Clive Ruggles, have taken a more cautious approach, accepting a few of the lunar alignments as plausible but rejecting most of the more complex theories. The moon's cycle is much more complicated than the sun's, and proving an intentional lunar alignment is very difficult. Did they have a concept of a spherical Earth? Did they understand what caused the seasons? Or was their astronomy purely practical and religious, a way of marking time and honoring their gods? And if the midwinter sunset was the main event, what was the giant trilithon framing? Was it just a celestial gateway, or was there something on the horizon, a sacred hill, or a now vanished feature that the sun set behind? Number 3, why did they take it apart and rebuild it so many times? One of the most confusing things about Stonehenge is its constant state of change. We tend to think of it as a single project, but it was more like a perpetual building site. The layout was changed dramatically at least 5 or 6 times over its 1,500-year history. They didn't just add to it, they actively dismantled previous versions. The story starts with the Aubrey holes and the ditch and bank around 3000 BC. Then around 2600 BC came the bluestones from Wales. They were set up in a double circle at the center. This must have been a huge achievement, the culmination of a massive effort. But it didn't last. Perhaps only 100 years later, they were all taken down. Then came the Saracens around 2500 BC. The giant trilithons in the outer circle were erected. This was Stonehenge's grandest phase. But what happened to the bluestones? They weren't thrown away. They were reintegrated into the new design, placed in a circle inside the Saracens. But the tinkering didn't stop there. A few hundred years later, the bluestones were moved again. The circle was dismantled, and some of the stones were arranged into a horseshoe shape inside the Saracen horseshoe. They also seem to have carved a new set of holes, the Y and Z holes, outside the Saracen circle, perhaps with the intention of creating another bluestone circle there, but this plan was never completed. Why all this change? Why build something so monumental only to tear it down and start again? It seems incredibly wasteful. Each rebuilding would have been a huge undertaking. One possibility is that the monument had to be ritually renewed. Perhaps the act of deconstruction and reconstruction was part of its purpose. Every few generations, the community had to come together to rebuild their temple, to reaffirm their connection to the gods and their ancestors. The process was as important as the product. Another theory is that the changes reflect shifts in power or religion. A new chieftain or a new priestly cult might take control and want to reshape the monument to fit their own cosmology. The change from a bluestone-focused monument to a sarsen-focused one could represent a major political or religious revolution. The old gods were demoted, and new, bigger gods took their place. It could also be that they were learning and experimenting. Maybe the first bluestone circle didn't work as they intended. Perhaps the acoustics weren't right, or the astronomical alignments were slightly off. So they decided to start over, using their new knowledge to build a better version. Stonehenge could be seen as a 1,500-year-long research project. The final, unfinished phase with the Y and Z holes is particularly mysterious. It looks like a grand plan was started and then suddenly abandoned. Why? Did the society that supported Stonehenge collapse? Did they run out of resources, or did their belief system change so profoundly that they no longer needed the monument? It's the last entry in a long, strange building log. What could have been so wrong with the first bluestone circle that they felt the need to tear it down completely? Was the arrival of the Sarsens a hostile takeover of a sacred site, with the victors imposing their own giant stones over the smaller ones of the vanquished? And what was the grand plan for the Y and Z holes? What would Stonehenge have looked like if they had finished it? Number 2, were some stones secondhand? This is one of the most radical and intriguing new ideas about Stonehenge. Like, what if the bluestones were not quarried specifically for Stonehenge? What if they were already part of another ancient monument in Wales, which was later dismantled and moved to Salisbury Plain? This would make Stonehenge a second-hand monument, a piece of prehistoric recycling. The main proponent of this theory is Mike Parker Pearson. The evidence comes from the dating of the bluestone quarries in the Preseli Hills. As we saw, the quarries at Carngodog and Craigros Efelin show activity around 3000 BC. But the bluestones don't appear at Stonehenge until around 2600 BC. That's a 400-year gap. What were the stones doing for all that time? Parker Pearson's suggestion is that they were first erected near the quarries in Wales to form a local stone circle. The builders of Stonehenge didn't just want any old bluestones, they wanted the specific stones from this pre-existing sacred circle. The moving of the monument was a hugely significant political and religious act. It could have been the result of a migration of people from Wales to Wessex, bringing their ancestral stones with them. Or it could have been an act of theft, with a powerful Wessex tribe raiding Wales and stealing their most sacred monument as a symbol of their dominance. The team has been searching for the site of this hypothetical first circle in Wales. They've identified a few promising locations, including one called Wan Mon, where a series of empty stone holes suggests a large circle once stood. In a 2021 article in Antiquity, Parker Pearson's team argued that the diameter of this circle and some of its geological features match Stonehenge. They even found a stone hole with an unusual cross-section that matches one of the bluestones at Stonehenge. If this theory is correct, it changes everything. The story of Stonehenge doesn't start on Salisbury Plain. It starts 180 miles away in the Welsh Mountains. Stonehenge is not just a monument, it's a monument made of another, older monument. It embodies a deep connection between two of the most important sacred landscapes in Neolithic Britain. The bluestones are not just building materials, they are relics, imbued with the history and spiritual power of another place. It also helps to explain why they went to so much trouble to get these specific stones. They weren't just quarrying rock, they were moving a whole temple. However, the evidence is not conclusive. The link between Wan Mon and Stonehenge is still being debated by other archaeologists. Some argue that the evidence for a large dismantled stone circle at Wan Mon is weak. It's a tantalizing idea, but it's not yet proven. But it opens up a whole new way of thinking about the stones. They have a history. They had a life before Stonehenge. They are not just objects, but characters in a long unfolding story. If the bluestones were moved, was it a peaceful act of union between two cultures, or was it the spoils of war? What happened to the people who originally built the circle in Wales? Did they move with the stones, or were they left behind with an empty, desecrated sanctuary? And if the blue stones are secondhand, what about the Saracens? Could some of them also have been part of older, now vanished monuments on the Marlborough Downs before being moved to Stonehenge? Number one, what technology are we missing? This is the ultimate question. After all the theories, all the experiments, all the scientific analysis, we are still left with a profound sense of awe and puzzlement. How did they do it? Is it possible that we are missing a key piece of the puzzle? A lost technology or a form of knowledge that we just can't conceive of from our modern perspective. It's easy to let the imagination run wild with ideas of alien intervention or lost Atlantean sciences. But the real answer is probably more subtle and more impressive. The Lost technology was most likely not a physical device, but a deep, intuitive understanding of things we have forgotten. Think of their knowledge of materials. They knew which wood was best for sledges, which plants made the strongest ropes, and which stone would last for eternity. This was a PhD level understanding of their environment, passed down through generations. Think of their social technology, the ability to organize thousands of people for a common goal, to motivate them, to feed them, to direct their labor over centuries. This is a form of technology too. It's the software that runs the society. We don't know how it worked. Was it based on religious charisma, a complex kinship system, or brutal coercion? Whatever it was incredibly effective. And what about their mental technology? Their understanding of geometry, astronomy, and acoustics. They seem to have had a different way of seeing and understanding the world. They could plan in 3 dimensions, visualize complex structures, and think in terms of timescales that are alien to us. They didn't need blueprints because the plan was in their heads, held in a collective cultural memory. Some have proposed more concrete, but still speculative, ideas. The engineer Christopher Dunn has suggested that ancient civilizations might have used sonic drills and levitation based on an advanced understanding of acoustics and vibration. There is no evidence for this at Stonehenge, but it's a reminder that we shouldn't assume their physics was the same as ours. Perhaps the missing piece is simpler. What if they had a much more sophisticated understanding of levers and counterweights than we give them credit for? A small team of people, with the right knowledge of mechanical advantage, can move incredible weights. Maybe it wasn't about brute force at all, but about cleverness. The real answer is that we don't know. Stonehenge stands as a monument to the limits of our own knowledge. It challenges our modern arrogance. It reminds us that people with the simplest of tools can achieve the most astonishing things. The technology they had was their own bodies, their environment, and, most importantly, their minds and their shared will. That may be the only technology they needed. What if they had a simple chemical process for splitting stone, a plant extract, or a mixture that could create microfractures when applied? What if their understanding of calendars and celestial cycles was so advanced that it had a predictive astrological component that dictated every stage of the construction? And the most chilling question of all, what if there is no missing technology, and the monument was built simply with the sweat, blood, and broken bodies of thousands of people, driven by a belief so powerful that it made the impossible seem necessary?